The morning after my mother's funeral, I stood on her porch with my suitcase, only to find the locks had been changed. Sophie, my brother's wife, smiled from the window before pulling the curtains shut. She didn't say a word, but I knew what it meant. I wasn't welcome. Everyone believed Sophie's sweet act, but they didn't see her slipping jewellery into her bag while my mother was dying. I told myself I'd walk away, but then I got a message from an unknown number. A single photo, Sophie in my mother's study, holding a red envelope. The night before my mother's birthday, the house glowed like it had in my childhood. Warm light spilling onto the front lawn, the faint scent of cinnamon drifting from the kitchen. I stepped inside to the familiar sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Mark was already in the living room, one arm slung casually around Sophie's shoulders. She turned, her smile a perfect mask for the small, assessing glance she gave me. "Claire, you made it," she said, the tone bright, almost too bright, like polished silver hiding rust. Mark clapped me on the back, the force just a shade harder than necessary, and guided me toward the centre of the room where Mother sat in her favourite chair, her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Oh, my girl," she whispered, pulling me down into a hug. Her hands were thin, almost fragile, but the warmth in them was the same as when I was 10 years old, and she'd tuck me in at night. When she pulled away, she held out a small velvet box. "I want you to have this." Inside, nestled against dark silk, was the family's heirloom necklace, delicate gold links with a single tear-shaped pearl at the centre. My breath caught. "Mother, It belongs to you now," she said simply, fastening it around my neck. Sophie leaned in, her perfume sharp and floral. "It's beautiful on you, Claire," she murmured. But as she adjusted the clasp, her eyes flicked to mine, quick, calculating, and then to the necklace again, lingering just long enough to make me feel like she'd made a note of it in some private ledger. I could swear the clasp felt loose, as if it might slip free with the right tug. Dinner was loud, full of overlapping voices and the clatter of cutlery. Sophie floated from guest to guest, her laughter perfectly timed, her hand warm on every shoulder. Mark told a story about a fishing trip, his eyes skimming past me each time the table erupted in laughter. I caught Sophie watching Mother more than once, her gaze flicking to the older woman's hands, the ring she always wore, the subtle bulge in her cardigan pocket where she kept her house keys. Later, when the cake came out, Mark wrapped an arm around me again. "You know," he said, grinning for the benefit of the crowd, "maybe I should hold on to that necklace for you. Wouldn't want you to lose it." The room laughed. It was the kind of laugh people give when they think they're in on the joke. But I heard the undercurrent, something just sharp enough to sting. "I'll manage," I said lightly, but my fingers went to the clasp at the back of my neck. Sophie, standing just behind Mark, sipped her wine. "Oh, I'm sure Claire doesn't have to worry about the inheritance," she said, her voice sugar-coated but pitched just loud enough for the table to hear. "She's independent. She doesn't need to rely on things like that." A ripple went through the room, polite smiles hiding small flashes of curiosity. Mother's hand paused halfway to her teacup. She looked at Sophie for a moment, then at me, as if weighing something. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, she coughed, deep, racking, and reached for her napkin. Mark leaned in, fussing over her, while Sophie patted her back with a practiced hand. Whatever Mother had meant to say dissolved into the hum of conversation, leaving only the echo of the moment hanging between us. I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the warmth of the lights and the familiar hum of the house. But there was a shadow to the evening I couldn't ignore, a faint crack in the perfect picture we were all pretending to live in. As the guests began to leave, Sophie pressed a slice of cake into my hand, her smile flawless. "Drive safe, Claire," she said. But as I turned to go, I felt her eyes on my back. And I knew, though I couldn't yet explain why, that the necklace around my throat was less a gift and more a marker. That night, lying in my childhood bed, I kept hearing Mother's half-formed words, the cough that had stolen them away. I reached up to touch the necklace, finding the clasp just a little looser than I remembered. In the silence, it felt almost like a warning. The first time I drove to see Mother after her birthday, Sophie met me at the door with a sympathetic smile. "She's just fallen asleep," she said, lowering her voice, as though the mere sound of it might disturb the old woman. "Best to let her rest," I left quietly, telling myself it was nothing, that Mother needed her strength. The second time, the story was the same. Sophie stepped outside before I could reach the door, closing it gently behind her. "She's been so tired lately, Claire. I don't want to risk waking her." There was a firmness in her tone that didn't match her words. By the third attempt, my patience had worn thin. I caught a glimpse of the living room behind her, the sofa where Mother used to read, the sunlight catching on the picture frames along the mantel. Except a few were missing: the photo from my graduation, the one of Father holding me as a baby. The space where they had been was bare, a faint rectangle on the wall where the dust hadn't yet settled. That night, my phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "Mother's exhausted. Don't come by this week. No greeting, no explanation beyond those 7 words." I stared at the screen, reading them over and over, feeling the blunt chill of them seep into my bones. I told myself I was imagining it, that families go through awkward patches, that Sophie was trying to help. But the unease lodged itself deeper every day, like a splinter I couldn't dig out. A week later, I learned from a cousin that Sophie had called a family meeting at the house. I hadn't been invited. It was just for the people handling arrangements, my cousin stammered when I asked. Arrangements for what? Mother was still alive. My hands went cold as I hung up. The following afternoon, my phone rang. It was Mr. Hale, Mother's attorney. "Claire," he said, his voice tight. "I'd like to set up a meeting to go over some matters regarding your mother's estate." I sat up straighter. "Estate? She's—" But before I could finish, his tone shifted. "Actually, something's come up. I'll have to get back to you." There was a faint tremor in his voice, the sound of someone about to say more, but swallowing it down. The line went dead before I could ask another question. That evening, I drove past Mother's house. Through the gap in the curtains, I saw Sophie at the dining table, papers spread out before her. Mark was beside her, speaking low, his hands moving in sharp gestures. The sight made my stomach knot. 2 days later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was from an unknown number. No words, just an image. I tapped it open and froze. It was Sophie, her back bent over the tall oak cabinet in Mother's study, the one that had been locked for as long as I could remember. In her hands, a sheaf of documents, and on the desk beside her, the small iron key Mother kept on a chain around her neck. The date stamp at the bottom corner showed it was taken last week. My pulse thudded in my ears. Who had sent this? Why? I stared at the image until the edges blurred, 1,000 questions fighting for space in my mind. The only thing I knew for certain was this: whatever Sophie was doing in that room, she hadn't wanted me to see it. Somewhere in the house I grew up in, pieces of my family's past, my past, were disappearing one by one. And now I had proof, even if I didn't yet understand what it meant. Mother's funeral was held on a grey, windless morning that felt suspended in time. The church was half full, the air thick with the scent of lilies. I sat near the front, numb, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles ached. Mark delivered a short, practiced eulogy. Sophie dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her sobs perfectly timed. As the mourners filed past me afterward, a man I didn't recognise paused. He was in his 50s, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to study me too closely. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and for the briefest moment his gaze sharpened as if to say something else, something meant only for me. But then he moved on, leaving me with a faint shiver crawling up my spine. When I returned to the house later that day, my key didn't work. The lock had been changed. Sophie stood in the doorway wearing Mother's soft grey cashmere shawl, the one she'd promised to give me last Christmas. Her smile was polite but empty. "I think it's best if you call before coming over from now on," she said, her tone edged with finality. "My things are still inside," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "We'll sort all that out soon," she said, already closing the door. The latch clicked shut before I could speak again. As I stood there, stunned, a man in a black suit, the same one who had been arranging flowers at the church, approached me. He glanced over his shoulder, then leaned close. "I probably shouldn't tell you this," he murmured, "but someone paid for the funeral with a cheque signed by your mother. The thing is, it was dated 2 days after she passed." The words punched the air out of me. "Are you sure?" He nodded once sharply and walked away. I drove home in a fog, my mind replaying the detail again and again, a cheque signed after her death. It couldn't be possible unless someone had forged it, and if someone had, what else had they done? The days that followed blurred into one another. Work emails piled up unanswered. Friends texted less and less, and when they did, there was a distance in their words. I heard the rumours, how I'd been angling for a bigger share of the inheritance, how I'd made things difficult toward the end. I stopped going out. Meals went uneaten. One sleepless night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the grain of the wood beneath my hands. I thought about selling my apartment, leaving town, disappearing somewhere no one knew me, or the version of me Sophie had crafted for others to believe. The idea of fighting felt impossible. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from the same unknown number that had sent me the photo weeks earlier. This time, it was a short video. My breath caught as I tapped it open. Mother lay in a hospital bed, her face pale, but her eyes alert. Her hand was clasped around Mr. Hales, the family attorney. Her voice was weak but clear. "Don't let Sophie take everything." The screen went black, and I sat frozen, the sound of her words echoing in my ears. I played it again, leaning closer this time. That's when I saw it, on the bedside table, just within the camera's frame. A red envelope, thick and sealed, the corner tucked under a vase of flowers. A fresh wave of questions crashed over me. What was in that envelope? And why had someone gone to such lengths to show it to me? The red envelope haunted me for days. I replayed the video over and over, each time pausing on the moment it appeared in the corner of the frame, half hidden beneath the vase of carnations. I didn't know who had filmed it or why it had been sent to me, but I knew one thing. Whatever was inside had been important enough for my mother to keep close, even in her final days. I started asking quiet questions, combing through anyone who might have been at the hospital in her last weeks. A nurse remembered a woman visiting late one evening. Not the daughter-in-law, she clarified with a pointed glance, but couldn't recall her name. After a few more dead ends, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. "You're looking for the red envelope," the voice on the other end said, without preamble. It was low, deliberate, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. "Meet me tomorrow, 2:00, the cafe across from Hale and Associates." Then the line went dead. The next day I walked into the cafe, scanning the room until I saw a woman in her late 40s, a stack of papers tucked under her arm. Her hair was pulled into a severe knot, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that made me think she'd once been in a position where noticing details could mean survival. "I used to work for Mr. Hale," she began after I sat down. "I was there when your mother came in, 3 weeks before she passed. She changed her will." My breath caught. "Changed it how?" "She left everything to you. The house, the accounts, everything. And she added a clause. If any other named beneficiary engaged in abusive conduct toward her or tried to coerce her into altering her estate, they'd forfeit any claim." I sat back, stunned. "She knew," I whispered. The woman nodded. "She also knew they'd come for her. Sophie and Mark tried to get her to sign a transfer deed for the house a month earlier. I was there when she refused. She told them to get out. That was the last time I saw her before the will change." It was like the fog in my head had burned away in an instant, replaced with a searing clarity. Every closed door, every cold glance, every whisper behind my back, they weren't random. They were the edges of a plan, one that had been in motion long before I realised I was the target. When I left the cafe, the air felt different, charged. I wasn't a bystander anymore. From that day, I kept my movements quiet. I didn't confront Mark or Sophie. Instead, I began to watch them. I asked an old family friend to check local auction listings. I followed Sophie's social media more closely than I ever had, combing through the backgrounds of her photos. I visited antique shops, listening for gossip. It didn't take long. A week later, one of the dealers I'd quietly approached called me. "Claire, you might want to see this." In his shop, under the glass of a display case, was a silver music box that had belonged to my grandmother. Sophie had once scoffed at it, calling it old junk, but now it sat with a price tag that made my stomach twist. "Bought from Sophie Bennett last month," the dealer said, handing me the receipt. I took a photo of it, my pulse steady. Evidence. I kept digging. With every call I made, more pieces surfaced. A brooch from Mother's jewellery chest, sold to a private collector, a first edition book from her study, now in the possession of a bookstore 2 towns over. Then came the twist I didn't expect. One afternoon, I unlocked the small storage room in my apartment where I kept the few items I'd salvaged after Mother's death. I opened a cedar box at the back of the shelf, and there it was. The porcelain figurine, Sophie had sold to a well-known collector, according to the records I'd found, the same one down to the tiny chip on its left wing. I froze, the air around me suddenly too still. There were only 2 keys to my apartment, mine and the spare I'd given to her. I swallowed hard. If the figurine was here, then someone close to me had returned it or planted it. Either way, it meant someone inside my own circle had touched my things without my knowing. I closed the box carefully, my mind spinning. Was it an ally trying to protect me? Or someone working for Sophie, planting doubt where they knew it would hurt? That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I thought of my mother's voice in the video, of the clause in the will, of Sophie in the study with those documents. I thought of the red envelope, still missing, still out there. The truth was close now. I could feel it, like heat rising from the ground before a storm. But the closer I got, the more I realised the danger wasn't just from Sophie and Mark anymore. Somewhere in the shadows between us, another hand was moving pieces on the board. And I needed to know whose it was before I made my next move. The conference room smelled faintly of leather and paper, a scent that clung to the panelled walls and polished oak table. I sat at one end, hands folded, while Mark and Sophie settled opposite me. Sophie's lipstick was a precise shade of crimson, her pearl earrings catching the light. Mark looked smug, the kind of smug that comes from knowing or thinking you've already won. "Let's make this quick," Sophie said, adjusting her blazer. "We have a dinner reservation." Mr. Hale, the family attorney, cleared his throat and placed 2 sealed envelopes on the table. "Before we begin, I want to be clear. There are 2 documents here. One is an earlier version of your mother's will. The other is the final, legally binding version she signed." Sophie leaned forward, eyes bright. "Then let's start with the first." Hale opened the first envelope and read aloud, "The house to Mark, the savings to be divided, a few personal effects to me." Sophie's smile widened with each line, but then Hale paused, placing the papers back inside. "This version," he said evenly, "was presented under questionable circumstances. It was never filed. And based on evidence in my possession, it was signed under duress." Mark's jaw tightened. "What are you implying?" "That your wife," Hale said, meeting Sophie's gaze, "attempted to coerce your mother into transferring property against her wishes." Before they could protest, he slid the second envelope across the table and broke the seal. "This," he said, "is your mother's final will." His voice was steady as he read, "Every asset, including the house, bank accounts and valuables to me, with the clause, any beneficiary found to have engaged in abusive conduct toward her would forfeit their claim." The colour drained from Sophie's face. Mark sat back, stunned, his fingers drumming against the armrest. Hale closed the folder, but didn't move it away. Instead, he leaned back, folding his hands. "Sophie," he said quietly, "before we finalise this, would you like me to play the video?" For a moment, no one moved. "What video?" Sophie asked, her voice sharp. Hale reached for a small tablet on the table and pressed play. The room filled with the sterile hum of a hospital room. My mother appeared on the screen, frail but alert, sitting upright in bed. Sophie's voice came first, loud, cutting, accusing her of favouritism, of ruining Mark's life, of throwing everything away for the weak one. Mother's voice was soft, trying to calm her, but Sophie's tone rose, harsh and relentless. She leaned over the bed, her face twisted as she hissed words I could barely stand to hear. Mark stood in the background, silent, his arms crossed, watching. When the video ended, the room was utterly still. Hale turned to Sophie. "This," he said, "meets the clause's definition of abusive conduct. The court will see it the same way." I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The weight of the silence pressed in on Sophie until her composure cracked. "This is taken out of context," she snapped, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Then I heard the faint click of a camera. I turned my head just enough to see a man near the doorway, a local journalist I recognized, lowering his phone, the red light on his recorder still blinking. He had been there the whole time, blending into the corner. Mark noticed him too. "You invited the press?" he asked, his voice low but venomous. "No," I said evenly, "but I'm not surprised they showed up." The reporter didn't leave. He stayed, jotting notes as Sophie's mask slipped further, her words turning frantic, defensive, desperate. Around the table, the extended family sat frozen, watching the woman they had praised for years unravel in real time. By the time Hale closed the meeting, the damage was done. Sophie's image as the perfect daughter-in-law lay in tatters. Her voice from the video echoing in everyone's ears. And somewhere in the back of the room, a story was already being written. The first morning I woke in my mother's house, the air felt lighter than I remembered. I walked through each room slowly, my fingers trailing along familiar walls. Dust motes swirled in the beams of sunlight, pushing through the curtains. One by one, I opened the windows, letting fresh air flood the space, carrying away the stale scent of months of closed doors. The house didn't feel like Sophie's territory anymore. It was mine, but more than that, it felt like hers again. I could almost hear her humming in the kitchen, the faint clink of her teacup against the saucer. In her bedroom, I began the slow task of putting things back where they belonged. While sorting through the tall dresser, I noticed one drawer sticking slightly. Pulling it open, I found a false bottom I'd never seen before. Beneath it lay an envelope, the paper yellowed at the edges. My name was written across it in my mother's handwriting. I sat on the bed and opened it carefully. Inside was a single page, folded twice. "My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, then the fight is over and I trust you have won. But I want you to remember, life is not just about winning. It is about lifting others when you can. I have seen too many women lose their rightful place, their security, their dignity, because no one stood beside them. Use what you've been given not only to protect yourself, but to protect others. Don't just win, help others win too. Love, Mother." I held the letter in my lap for a long time, her words pressing against my chest like a second heartbeat. Winning against Sophie had felt like closing a wound, but this felt like opening a new door. In the weeks that followed, I set about honouring her wish. I met with an attorney to establish a foundation, a fund dedicated to supporting women cut out of inheritances, women who'd been silenced by the people closest to them. I named it the Red Envelope Fund, after the object that had started my journey back into the fight. The fund's first initiative was to provide legal aid for those women, but I didn't stop there. I reached out to the reporter who had been in that conference room, the one who'd seen Sophie's unravelling firsthand. We discussed an investigative series on coercion, inheritance fraud, and the quiet epidemic of familial abuse that never made headlines. When the first article was published, I read it in the living room, sunlight spilling over the pages. The story didn't name Sophie or Mark, but it didn't need to. It was about patterns, about the faces behind closed doors, about the people who thought no one would ever challenge them. Messages began pouring in, some from women I'd never met, others from people I hadn't spoken to in years. They shared their stories, their gratitude, and, most surprisingly, their willingness to stand up for someone else now that they knew they weren't alone. One afternoon, as I was organising old photographs in the study, I paused at a picture of Mother holding me as a child. Her eyes in the photograph were the same as I remembered from my last visit to the hospital. Tired but fierce, full of quiet resolve. I realised then that the real victory wasn't in watching Sophie lose everything or in reclaiming the house and the heirlooms. The victory was in knowing I could now stop someone else from going through the same pain. The house had changed too. It no longer felt like a place of loss. It was alive again, full of movement, purpose, and the echo of my mother's voice, reminding me that true justice is never just for one person. As evening fell, I stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, the first stars glimmering in the sky. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear children laughing, the sound drifting up the street. I thought of Sophie and Mark, and for the first time I didn't feel anger. They were still trapped in the same narrow world they had built for themselves. While I had stepped into something far larger, justice had been served. But more than that, something broken had been mended, not just in me, but in the lives that would be touched by what came next. I closed the front door gently behind me, the letter still safe in my desk, and the windows open to let the night breeze carry my mother's words through the halls.